right.
Yes.
I was doing the same tour for
Right.
Delapre. So
Yes.
there's a bit of confusion about it.
Oh, yes, yes.
All right. And then hopefully I'll catch them.
Do you want
Yeah, why isn't this
okay,
showing
everyone, we're
up?
just going to have a quick clarification on
Just really
tours.
quick, for anyone that's wondering what's happening with the tours for today will be the same as the tours tomorrow. Originally, we were supposed to do one tour, but there's so many people we can't get them all in, so we're going to split them. So there'll be a tour in the Abbey, and then there'll be a tour at the stables. I'm not entirely sure. I think people going on the stables tour might meet at the stables. But you know where the Abbey stables are?
It's not showing.
I think it's always starting at the front door, and most yes, the stables and the entry central courtyard.
There we go. So head for myself. And so if there's one today, one tomorrow, that's absolutely fine. And if you put on the same for the see.
Yeah, all good. So yeah, that's all ready for
Oh, it'll just go
Bethan.
on.
Yeah, so she can just go straight onto that. We'll need to switch to the other one when Trados is.
Yep.
And then
Okay, I'm just going to give it another minute for those online. All right. Okay, brilliant. It's now 11:15, so we're going to start our first session today, and this is a session that's going to look at equality, diversity, and inclusion. I'm really delighted to chair this session. For me, this is one of the most important topics we've got to start to really get under the surface of and start picking about. I'm really interested in how we create a better sense of belonging in the conversations we actually create and how we open them up. Heritage for me has been notoriously good at othering issues. We love a label, we love a badge, we love a list. And often when you look at those badges and those lists, they can become quite oppressive in the way they actually make you relate to the stuff that's actually out there. So again, how we actually start to think around these ideas and actually break down some of those barriers becomes really important. Now, we have 3 speakers this morning. I'm going to ask them up one by one. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end of all 3 speakers, and then we'll get them back up so that actually we can ask your questions. My one apology to speakers, I know this is something that absolutely challenges me. We do ask that you speak in front of the microphone and to the camera for everyone online. I do like a good dance around when I talk, which standing still is a real challenge, particularly keeping my arms still. So please try and do that. And again, when we do the questions, we will speak into the microphone and the camera. But first up, I would like to welcome Bethan Lemuzeret to the stage. Bethan is going to talk to us about seeking happy heritage futures in the Anthropocene, an alternative framework of heritage and nature drawn from anti-oppressive theory. Bethan, thank you.
It seemed like very wordy when you just read that out. Hello, I'm Bethan. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter. I'm looking at different ways to approach heritage contexts that are rooted in anti-oppressive theory, so like centering equity and better able to deal with climate contexts. So today I'm going to talk about the ways that we conceptualize nature and how that interacts with heritage and with well-being. Just terminology-wise, these are very broad terms that struggle to be defined. When I look at heritage in my research, that's kind of everything under that umbrella. So places, buildings, objects, languages, all that good stuff. I situate my work in the Anthropocene to kind of recognize the interactions between climate change and equity in that space. And then I base my methodology on anti-oppressive theory. I use that as a catch-all term with an awareness of the limitations of catch-all terms. So that's feminist theory, queer theory, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and some beyond capitalist theory as well. So my research is in developing a framework for heritage approaches with the goal to it's not so much about critiquing other approaches. There's not one right way of doing heritage, but proposing a different methodology, a different pathway that is based around these anti-oppressive texts. So these texts I use, these writers writing anti-oppressive theory, they're not heritage texts, they're not wellbeing texts, they're by a wide range of people, from the 20th century as well as the 21st, looking at power, looking at systems of minoritization and oppression, and looking at ways of knowing and interacting with the world that have historically been sidelined by kind of mainstream Western heritage approaches. So from those texts, I draw key themes that can be applied to heritage contexts, one of which is nature. So it's kind of situating the presentation. So the question with nature is, how can changing dominant conceptualizations of nature suggest different heritage approaches? So how is this all tied up with well-being? So we know that well-being and heritage are entangled with each other. That's why we're all here. These big concepts that are universal in that everybody has them, but specific in that they're enacted differently in people's lives. And that's really kind of the focus, is bringing it back to people, how these are embodied through people and their social contexts and their physical contexts. And we talk, of course, about how heritage and heritage experiences affect people's well-being. With my methodology of kind of using anti-oppressive theory as foundational, I'm entangling well-being right there at the beginning as kind of a guiding tool for heritage theory and practical approaches. And then talking about nature today, so this is a non-comprehensive kind of list of how a lot of well-being conversations think about nature. So the primary one there is nature as of benefit to people, kind of as a resource sometimes. So thinking about, that's typically kind of green spaces and undeveloped nature. We also see discussions of human nature, an idea of being true to our natures, whatever that might mean. And then also exploration of well-being as something physical, so as something that goes through the body. I see that as tying into ideas of nature, because it's an integration of the physical self. But when I'm talking about nature, kind of in my framework and in my presentation today, it's kind of taking it back and saying, well, what do we mean when we talk about nature? How are we conceptualizing it? What boundaries are remaining? And there's been a lot of exploration in various fields, and definitely in heritage, about this kind of nature-human relationship. But what ways are we not looking at it? And how does that intersect with heritage and with well-being? And the way I do that is by looking at this anti-oppressive theory, which ties in really neatly with well-being kind of at this beginning stage, because they have a really closely connected relationship, because well-being work recognizes how experience of the world is intersectional, is different for different people. It's different within communities, between communities. It doesn't look the same everywhere, and it has to be addressed holistically. And part of that is the structures and systems that support people's well-being in terms of their rights, their political emancipation, all those kinds of things. So well-being work should aim to work anti-oppressively, and using anti-oppressive theory as this foundational kind of tool in my framework centers well-being right there at the beginning. So I'm now going to talk you through actually what my framework suggests to do with nature and kind of how this connects to ideas of well-being. Just as a reference point, when I do that, the well-being, specific well-being connections I'm drawing out are from these three frameworks. I'm not going to go into them today, but just if anybody is into that kind of thing, this is where I'm drawing those from. Okay, so pulling from anti-oppressive knowledge to suggest approaches to heritage contexts and how that connects to well-being. So lots of anti-oppressive writers identify kind of this dualistic pattern of thought, this Cartesian Enlightenment system, as culturally and temporally specific. So it's not a universal way of seeing the world. It's not a way that everybody sees nature as distinct from human. And so we can look forward into heritage approaches and say, what does it look like if there is no distinction between humans and nature? at all. So all human behaviour is natural. So heritage is natural. It's natural animals doing something natural in the world. And this connects to well-being ideas of how important it is to live in relation to the world, to other species, and to ourselves and to other parts of the world around us, rather than separating ourselves out. And it's recognised that this dualistic pattern is not just culturally specific, it's also harmful in lots of contexts. So the nature kind of culture dichotomy has been used to animalise people. It still is in certain contexts. So some people are more human than others, some people are more animal than others. So moving away from that as part of kind of addressing the inequalities that have been part of various heritage traditions in the past. And this ties to wellbeing ideas of the importance of equality for people, respect and rights and so on. Then in anti-oppressive knowledge, I've also pulled out an awareness of how capitalist and colonialist projects require disconnection from place. So in order to turn places into resources, like whether that's like resources under the ground or animals or plants or even people, there needs to be an idea that the population is separate from the place, and therefore it doesn't matter what you do to the place, you can use it because people are not connected, they're not integrated into that landscape. So a counter to that kind of mentality, which is a big contributor to like climate change and various inequalities, is a whole systems approach. So looking at places all together, saying we can't separate out people from place, we can't separate out heritage from other aspects of a landscape or an environment or a context. And this connects to wellbeing ideas of the fact that our wellbeing is not separate from the world around us. So ecosystem health and that kind of thing affects us. And then looking at how the body and emotion have been recognised within lots of anti-oppressive texts as really significant sources of power and thought. And that is again breaking apart another dualism, this kind of like emotion reason dualism, to say that actually the body is a really powerful place of resistance and engagement, and recognising that everything we do is mediated through our physical existence. So that's for heritage, saying that heritage includes emotive and bodily experiences, tying to wellbeing ideas of the kind of importance of our physical selves for our well-being, and how that's all kind of integrated together. So these are kind of the theory. I'm aware it's like quite a lot of text on the screen, but it gives you an idea of how the theory in my framework develops. And then what I do in my research is some kind of deep dive case studies. I don't have time to go super deep into any of those today, but what I am going to do is just show some heritage approaches that are suggested by this framework and by some of these proposals that might like fit with different contexts that you're familiar with, or different ones you see over the next couple of days. So answering the question or addressing the question, kind of how can we move outside of the human nature kind of system, is thinking about things like site categorization. So of course, famously with like UNESCO, but also kind of if you've got a site that has archaeology and you've also got kind of a biodiversity plan, are they being managed entirely separately? Or how do they interact with one another? How do those features of a place actually depend on one another? And can they be managed more holistically? Thinking about how recognizing ourselves and our heritage as nature alters responses to threats. So this is connected particularly to how climate change has kind of exacerbated and identified some of the kind of falsity of traditional preservation approaches, the idea that you can't actually keep everything the same and you can't keep it forever. And that's experienced in lots of places as a stress and as a threat. But if we think of ourselves as natural and our heritage as natural, that kind of integrates ideas of change, of birth, of death. And so we're looking at something that kind of is always changing. So how does that shift our perspective on future changes and how we might manage things iteratively rather than trying to lock in solutions forever? Then thinking about kind of the political and the activist side of things, kind of being unable to disentangle people's heritage from the rest of their lives, either functionally and also ethically. So heritage as a kind of political force, which I'm aware some people would rather be, kind of avoid politicizing it, but I think it's always political. So how is that directly addressed, and how can heritage work alongside different causes, different organizations, things like environmental justice, climate justice, land rights in various parts of the world? How is that all integrated together? And then finally, thinking about the body again. So how can the body actually be integrated into heritage contexts? And this is in terms of visitors, but also kind of in terms of decision-making as well. So the most obvious one there is things like museums, this idea of some senses being absent from heritage contexts, particularly like touch, which is connected to how we want to preserve things. So what does it mean to actually welcome people's bodies more into an environment? How could they be integrated into experience? And also in terms of people decision making and managing places, how are our emotions integrated into those practices, and what might that look like? So this has been like very whistle stop, but hopefully it gives you kind of an idea of some of the threads of my research, and I'd be happy to kind of explore more specific contexts at the end or in the next couple of days.
Wow. That was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I've often wondered how clever people put some of the thoughts that whiz around in my head into really intelligent, actually, ways of setting stuff out there. I've got about 1 million questions for you. You're not going to be allowed to go for 2 days to actually do that. Right. Next up, we're going to invite Trey to the stage. And Claire, can you just help me make sure I got his presentation in the right place, please?
So if you minimise this.
Exactly.
No, if you minimise that.
Oh, yeah.
And then it should be open. I don't know where it's gone. There we go.
Great.
We can see it. It looks lovely. You might be worth a try.
No, Joy?
Yeah, you're back on the screen.
How do we get to that page?
Do we need to just close down that PowerPoint rather than minimise it? We don't need it again for this session, so.
I'll just make a
Yeah.
page. Thank you.
We got it.
Excellent.
Excellent.
All right. Okay, brilliant. Thank you all for that. Sorry for the technical things. Right, I'd like to now introduce our second speaker, Trey Ventor-Griffiths, who's independent public historian and sociologist. Trey is going to talk to us about being Black, being unwell, health and heritage, and a colonial experience. You can have a go at saying that better.
Yeah. Yeah, I've decided to start change the title as well. So the title originally said epistemology, which is theory of knowledge and how we know things and why we know things and how we get to know things. So in academia, knowledge making and how knowledge is made and produced is called epistemology. So the violence of that in terms of, say, for example, erasure of Black history from the school curriculum, we would call that epistemic violence. So it's violence through knowledge and knowing and how we know things. But I decided to change the bit of title that said that to keeping it colonial, which does it in a more accessible way, I think, in terms of these sorts of sites and how they're kept colonized through practices and behaviors and policies and that sorts of things. Morning, though heritage includes many areas, I've opted to focus on country estates like this in Northamptonshire context. In part, autoethnography, so another big term. So ethnography is the study and theory of culture. So autoethnography is how personal experiences can be used to talk about cultural experiences. So this paper situates debates of racism and wellness and heritage, and was written responding to Historic England's use of the term people and supporting communities, both in air quotes, in the original call. At least in a local context, the use of these terms largely, I think, does not include everybody. Really, I find terms like this, even subliminally, speak to cultures of whiteness in that anonymity of who they're talking about. So which people, which communities are they talking about? So in saying who is not named, that's whiteness. Whiteness as sameness, as everybody is the same, even though we are one big human family in that sense, but we're not all the same. We all have different cultures, genders, classes, and different experiences, and all those things need to be discussed together. As Richard Dyer writes, we white people will speak of, say, the blackness or Chineseness of friends, neighbors, colleagues, customers, or clients, and it may be in the most genuine or friendly manner, but we don't mention the whiteness of white people we know. He's a film studies scholar, and he wrote that in 1997 in a film context, but that equally applies to our day-to-day lives, whether that's heritage, policing, local authorities, so on. In the call for papers, I found Historic England's claims quite agreeable, but also quite idealistic of the situation, because I know particularly in a local Caribbean context, which is where my family come from, Delapre is not high on that list of venues in terms of what we use on a day-to-day basis. It's still seen as white, as places like this are viewed within that framing, I guess, high brownness and culture and things like that, very like gated communities in that sense, in addition to legacies of slavery and colonialism. For me, coming here over the years, I've experienced sort of that logic of empire through racist microaggressions, for example, being followed by staff members, experiences that are replicated in other places of society. So, for example, I will go to Tesco and shop. People that work there will think I'm going to shoplift effectively, and will follow me around the store thinking I'm going to steal something. And that's not an anomaly. If you're a black male, say 16 to 30, you are more likely to be followed in this way by private security firms and so on in shops. Likewise, stop and search practices by the police. You are questioned and under suspicion. These behaviours show I don't belong, and is in this logic of empire that polices black people in most parts of British life. Here I think about what the Marxist Guy Debord referred to as psychogeography, the effects of geographical locations on the emotions and the behaviours of individuals. Likewise, Toni Morrison wrote about something similar as rememory. Stately homes routinely force me to go through a litany of emotions due to their empire connections. Ideas of close-knit communities that we see in the rural replicates itself in heritage spaces, just as they do in policing and other environments. In sociology and criminology, we call these a canteen culture, a term that refers to the way in which people working in a particular environment can share a set of values, including prejudices. It's a term that has been applied to the police since the Macpherson report in 1999 as an explanation for police-based racism, following the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Whilst there have been pushes to include more black people into heritage, I would argue that the very fact that these places are sites of coloniality is really a question of why should we want to be included in the first place. For somewhere like the Tate, for example, this is reflected in their diversity data as well. Yet in culture and heritage, one sees it in not only who's allowed to work in these spaces, but also whose presence isn't seen as a problem. Martin Luther King is quoted on saying about the civil rights movement in America, "I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house." Due to these feelings while accessing the countryside, many black people may feel they cannot access many heritage sites. So whose health are these places good for? Heritage really has to ask, why should black people want to be included into a space that oppresses them? Which goes back to Neil's point about oppression earlier. Just because we can, does that mean we should? Can these places really extract that violence out of these sites when many were built on it as well, which was further evidence in the National Trust 2020 report into colonial slavery and their legacies. I think it was as many as 29 properties owned by the National Trust had links to compensation from the slave trade. Why should we want to integrate into whiteness? Many of these country houses were built off, if not sustained on, imperialism and colonialism. As Black people want to use them, many are still facing these colonizing imperatives, being policed as visitors and as employees. Black people in Britain are still seen as new arrivals, but we have been here for centuries. My family came to Northampton from Grenada in 1962. Yet I know our Northampton Black history goes back to the 1200s with Peter the Saracen, who made crossbows for the king. So there's histories like that as well in our local history too. Michel Foucault's work addressed the relationship between power and knowledge. In short, the practices of prisons broadly the culture of policing can be found everywhere, really. While there is not a police presence here, what I have found in the past are staff that act in a very police-like manner. Cultures of surveillance that the public knows in criminal justice contexts are everywhere, to the point human beings police each other, as we've seen in school context as well, being watched, being observed, being questioned. And for Black people visiting places like stately homes, heritage sites, the countryside and so forth, we may encounter white people, employees and visitors who did not expect us to be here. The racism, it gets you down, it plays on your mind. So whose health were historic England talking about in their call for papers? Who was polled? I found the claim optimistic, yet limited and too sure of itself, which is not always helpful in research context. It's better to have an open mind and let the findings show you the way, pretty much. Yet today, we are in a time where more Black people, brown people, and otherwise racially minoritized people are speaking out. Last month, as part of an APP about climate change, as many as 80 wildlife charities referred to the countryside as a racist colonial space. In another context, my colleague, poet and author educator Louisa Adjua Parker has written similarly about Somerset. Historic England's claims of good for people's health and well-being make me question the underpinning ideas of knowing people. Well, when we see that most people that use these estates are racialized as white, I expect that knowledge, so that epistemology, so how we know things, is an epistemology rooted in whiteness in that sense. So in 2021, Northampton and community activist, my friend and my colleague, Laura Graham, asked me to feature in one of the podcast episodes she did, commissioned for about Delapre Abbey. My episode talked about heritage, national trust, empire, and possibly where Delapre could fit into that. The organisation listened to my episode and contacted me to see if I was interested in working on a project that investigated the building's links with colonialism and slavery. Yet I raised concerns when I later saw adverts on their grounds with West Northants Council celebrating the Queen's Jubilee. However, Delapre effectively sits under a broader organisation, West Northants Council, a Tory council, who supports the monarchy. But I was not taken seriously and ultimately dismissed. Scenes of happy white families having tea on the lawn, celebrating the monarchy despite their role in colonial slavery, did not sit well with me as a Black person whose ancestors were branded with the hot irons of colonial slavery. And my family name can be found on the compensation register done by UCL in 2013. So the Ventor family name in Grenada, in St. George's. My grandfather was born there. He's one of 11 siblings. All his 11 siblings were born there. So Ventor is very much linked to slavery in Grenada, in the Grenadian context. It did not sit well with me. It struck me at the number of organisations that wanted to do anti-racism work, while also being pally with the establishment. Organisations showed that we wanted to do anti-racism work while marketing themselves in ways that were not, in fact, anti-racist. RE, monarchy, symbology. What was also happening around that time was that many activists, numbers of them Black, speaking out against the monarchy. So practices put me in a very difficult position as someone that wants to do this work as a freelancer and relies on freelance opportunities, but also has no love for the monarchy or those sorts of institutions. There were hard choices in wanting to make money, while at the same time, funders A lot of them will be conservatives. A lot of them will be monarchists. Like many heritage organisations run as charities, staff is lacking and sometimes can overcommit to what they're able to do. The real work does not get done because they need to make money, and anti-racism is not about accumulating money. How do heritage organisations do anti-racism work, focusing on racialised people's health, while appealing to their funders who may also have views to the opposite, people who are less likely to fund projects that challenges their worldviews, their political views as well. Last January, Delapre also ran a 3-day wellness festival on site. These are grounds owned by West Northants Council, and ultimately Delapre are tenants. Black people, brown people, and people otherwise not racialised as white were involved in this festival, but whiteness is a system, and you do not even have to be white to uphold it. Even as far as what was being advertised, it showed me organisations using its grounds as a backdrop for wellness practices that have been taken from the global south, so parts of Africa, Asia, and so on. For example, yoga is one of the big ones, and has become a pastime dominated by middle-class white women. It's not to say they shouldn't be allowed to do it, but more the questions of how cultural practices become co-opted. The late Bell Hooks wrote about similar things, as the commodification of otherness has been so successful because it is offered as a new delight, more intense, more satisfying than normal ways of doing and feeling. Within commodity culture, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish. That's mainstream white culture, she writes. And she wrote that in 1992, so we've developed quite a lot from then. So these grounds have been used for years for white people to escape, just as similar grounds are used around the country. For me, as well as the plantations themselves in the Americas, places like this are like the Auschwitz or the Buchenwald of the slave trade, and should be treated with the sensitivity and dignity of a mass grave. I don't feel comfortable on these sites or what they're used for very much in thinking of Guy Debord's psychogeography, where spaces and places evoke an emotional connection. I walk around this place and I've been stared at, I've been questioned, I've been watched. Sarah Ahmed, a sociologist, says that whiteness is only invisible for those who inhabit it. For those who don't, it's hard not to see whiteness. It even seems everywhere. Seeing whiteness is about living its effects, as effects that allow white bodies to extend into spaces that have already been taking their shape. Spaces in which black bodies and brown bodies stand out, stand apart, unless they pass, which means passing through space by passing as white. Her points are appropriate for black access to the countryside and many UK heritage sites. You walk around these places, the gardens, the buildings, the lakes, the grounds, and it is a space of whiteness. The bodies of black people, brown people stand out, we stand apart. White people escape into whiteness. Whose health are we talking about here? Which groups were polled? For a Historic England statement that seems to speak for everybody. In Northants, I know that numbers of black people do not come here because they really act as gated sites of belonging. Most staff are white, most volunteers are white, and the trustees are white. Further, the fact of hosting big concerts. Recently last summer, the UB40 concert, who got famous off the back of reggae music, while not inviting black Caribbean vendors, as another example. The countryside and places resembling the country persist as spaces where bodies not racialized as white are looked at with suspicion. There is no inclusion without access. So I think before we talk about diversity and inclusion, what about access? Black audiences and white audiences respond to things differently. And if you live being told you do not belong, you are unlikely to go somewhere. In most places in the global West, black people have been told they do not belong in certain spaces. In Northampton, I point to theatre and the museums. Playwright and actor Jeremy Harris went viral on TikTok last month after he talked about radically inviting black people into spaces where they don't belong. On Broadway, there were nights where they had black people nights. They called them blackout nights. Nobody's saying white folks can't go to them, but black people need to be radically invited because you do not go somewhere where you don't feel you're invited. There are spaces across this town and country designed around white people's comfort. While I cannot claim to speak for every single black person In the UK, I know Black people in Northampton may benefit from that radical invitation, yet saying heritage is good for everyone feels like a statement made in haste. And I think it is a statement in such a claim that speaks to that. While we are part of one human family, what whiteness does is treat everyone the same, with no individual differences that set us apart, effectively. Very much within a broader grift of what we call the equality, diversity, and inclusion industrial complex. And a lot of Black activists will tell you about how EDI has become for profit rather than for people's wellness in that sense. And that's the end of my paper. So thanks very much.
Trey, thank you so much. I mean, I'm struck just by listening to that. Again, this concept of how good heritage is at othering. Yeah, how we're good at this badging concept that we actually do, and then trying to say it's for everyone, but not really creating that sense of belonging or that, radical invitation in, I think is a really lovely way of actually saying it. How do we shape that up? I'm sure we'll come back to that at the end. Next, though, I'd like to introduce Kimberly Jones. Kimberly is an archaeologist and a volunteer with the Port of Antiquities scheme with the Swansea Egypt Centre and the National Museum of Wales. Kimberly is going to talk to us about inclusivity within heritage, a brief look at a 30-plus year of struggle with disabilities within the sector.
Right. Morning. Okay. It's more a case of this was sold as Ask for Live Experience. So I was going to call this a brief look at 30 years plus of struggle with disabilities, convincing employer with disability a disabled archaeologist is worth employing. So I'm just going to be looking at the barriers with a little bit of things that might have worked to overcome them. Okay. Disability barriers tend to be divided into three sections: actual problems caused by the disabilities, attitudes of employers, problems caused by changing legislation. First, in my case, admittedly, is what problems caused my disabilities. Absolutely none, despite club feet and vertigo attacks. The vertigo is not so serious with me anymore because we've now discovered what was causing it. Frustration. Frustration with two aspects. One is, as you might guess, my gender identity. Where I come from is a very transphobic area. For about 50 years, I've known what my gender was and have not been able to express it. End result, up to 10 seizures a day. Working in 2022 as a finds archaeologist with Historic England, being able to be both Kimberly and an archaeologist full time means I only had one little tiny attack, and that was right at the end because I was leaving. Unfortunately, the other aspect of the frustration hasn't been addressed, which is lack of employment. The latter is a bit of a vicious circle, since the more rejections I receive from employers, the worse the vertigo attacks get. The vertigo attacks are themselves responsible for the rejections, at least when it comes to most non-digging roles, since they mean I cannot drive. Ever since I graduated from Cardiff in 1990, I've run into that obstacle. While employers will occasionally employ me on fixed-term contracts without a driving license, as HE did in 2022, they're rare, and most permanent fines, etc. roles, employers won't move over on the driving license. Most employers? Yeah, okay. So that's where the second disability comes in, the deformed feet. Due to club feet, I can't dig on commercial infrastructure projects. This means that in the very rare cases when an employer has been prepared, or said they would be, to work around a lack of a driving license, I still keep working out, losing it to people with recent commercial experience. Right, I can dig. My actual deformities place no restrictions on what I can physically do. If I wasn't here, I'd be either training tonight or running a black belt only session in Shotokan Karate. Last night, I was running a black belt only session in Shaolin Kung Fu. I can walk across terrain all day, full pack. I'm actually fitter than I was when I was in the army. And in that case, it was only because of a malaria attack I didn't make the SAS. So, physically, I can do that with a 60-pound weight. That's well over a third of my body weight. And if I'm on site, yeah, full bucket, full bucket, full. Oh, sorry, I forgot that's full. But it won't be half of that. However, what it does mean is I can't wear modern standard safety boots. Penetration resistant soles don't enable you to go up as if you're wearing a high 18-inch heel. I mean, people see these heels, these aren't touching the ground when I'm walking. So it's not my disability has been the barrier, it's a combination of employers' attitudes and change legislation. Employers' attitudes. I have dug commercially, but not since 1999. In the 80s and 90s, employers were prepared far more to take people on site-specific contracts, and that's when I actually found more adjustments were made for disabilities because people were less concerned with, yeah, okay, yeah, we know you can do that site, so we'll employ you. You know, I used to get cases where, sorry, you can't work on this site, we need full safety boots. And then same day it's, are you still free? Yeah, okay, we've got another contract for you. Right, now I have been in contact recently with a number of employers who've assured me this shouldn't be a barrier because not all digs actually require sole protection by law, and employment law requires employers to rotate me around roles that do not. All these conversations have the same features. It's always somebody being asked to give feedback. The person saying is never actually hiring at the time. When they are hiring, they don't reply or say, sorry, we can't make an exception on this occasion, try somebody else. Okay, so that's actual physical barrier, but we also, I've also encountered actual discriminatory attitudes. And many of the people who have in the past stated them still have senior positions within archaeology and museums. A good example of this is a small unit that went out of business in 2008. I'd sent off a quick application in response to an ad in The Guardian. Any of the older people remember those? And got offered a short contract digging. Steel toe caps were quite okay then. Right. It was the way dig, we were all eating together in the local pub. That's when the problem occurred. One day, the dig director, who was also co-owner of the company, asked me why you don't ever see me drinking soft drinks. I told him it's because of medication I was on for the vertigo, and he was, to say the least, unhappy, accusing me of concealing information. Although he did shortly say afterwards he understood why I did it. Actually, I hadn't deliberately concealed it, it just wasn't an issue. And admitted he probably wouldn't have hired me had he known, and now he knows I'm taking that medication, he wouldn't hire me again, which was an interesting comment considering how much he praised the excellence of my work in writing and also how relieved he was I'd applied, since I was the only experienced archaeologist who'd actually done so. It's an interesting reflection on attitudes that he'd rather run a site short-handed than employ a disabled person whose work he praised. The shocking thing about it is actually the company were otherwise good employers. At the time, they were one of the best payers. They had good gender balance. They had a relaxed working attitude, excellent away accommodation, excellent subsistence rates. However, some aren't good on any count, which I'm saying the biggest block on my career was in 1992, the result of a repeat contract with what was then my only local employer. The director of the dig was constantly denigrating me because of my deformed feet. One example, which occurred more than once, was instructing me to take off my safety boots, despite this being an infrastructure project, to clean up something she'd noticed needed removing before photography. Her reasoning for always giving me the job was that my fairy feet, and yes, that is the exact quote, and remembering I was identifying publicly as male at the time, meant that no one would mistake my footprints for anything made by a human being. They'd assume, oh, it was some animal had got on there. After 5 weeks, I told her what I thought of it, and she basically said, well, you're not working for this company again, which for 30 years she has managed to enforce, because quite often I've run into people directing work for that company, and they said, we have only got half the number of people, why don't you apply? Application. Sorry, we're full up, no suitable vacancies. So, on top of which, we also still have attitudes you will still hear expressed. Whenever the issue of non-drivers finding it hard to get work is raised, there's always a kickback. Discussions on groups like Badger always trigger comments to the effect that having non-drivers is a nuisance, even if we're discussing medical-based adjustments for non-drivers. That people feel comfortable in saying this and not pulled up for it by admins may suggest how deep those attitudes go. It was further driven home to me in 2020 when union reps were calling on archaeology companies to ban employees from commuting via public transport. Obviously, there was a health reason. But when you pointed things out, you got the same initial problem. Oh, it's a problem. It's a nuisance having non-drivers. Oh, and just because you're disabled doesn't mean we should actually make any allowances for you. Right. It was interesting. I wonder how many other disadvantaged groups people would feel comfortable publicly posting on Facebook. Oh, it's a nuisance making adjustments for you, or not be slapped down for doing so. There's also what you will still get is, oh, sorry, I didn't realize. 2022 was when I actually came to most people as being transgender. At the time I was working on a project for Historic England, I'd arranged with the senior staff that at the end of the project, for the last 3 weeks, I would come out and be Kimberly. It was interesting that on that same day, various commercial partners were making transphobic jokes and comments. It wasn't aimed at me. They didn't know. But what was interesting, it was that feeling of, oh, we can make whatever, that we can make those comments. And then when you know, the comments don't reapply, they don't reoccur. Does suggest that left me felt there was a lot of prejudice about many things hiding behind a veneer of what is publicly acceptable. Okay, just quick on the legislation. Changes in legislation have raised barriers in disability employment within archaeology. Many of us remember the old Manpower Services Commission schemes to assist the unemployed. While the emotions conjured are mixed, two things are undeniable. It started the careers of some very good archaeologists, and it did widen participation in archaeology over both the short and long term. What most people don't know is actually we do have similar schemes available today. However, unlike the 1970s, there are new barriers to the implementation. The first is what Tony Robinson always goes, oh, health and safety legislation. Increased requirement for PPE and also the CSCS card have made employers reluctant to engage with these schemes. Or that was the feedback I got from some employers following a 2018 paper at TAG. Few said they'd like to participate, said they can't because of those issues. Of course, a lot of other employers said, well, we don't need to because our schemes give us all the people we like, so we don't want to make those adjustments. Which may go back to that one about, said, ask an employer who's not advertising for staff, and he will say, oh, yes, that adjustment should be made, that adjustment should be made. Oh, now you're hiring. Sorry. Right. Related to that is also guidelines. I had a big dig at some of the chief of guidelines in 2023 TAG conference because, again, a lot of employers have come back and said, it's not legislation, but it's sort of that the restrictions on non-salaried staff act as a major barrier to participation in these schemes, because unless you've set it in 6 months before when you applied for, you put in the tender, you can't have non-salaried staff. Right, the time. Okay, this does tend to lead to barriers in part because a lot of people with disabilities have often gone for non-standard ways of getting their experience, non-commercial. When I started in the 80s, nobody asked whether your experience was commercial. They said, oh, how many hours have you got? How many weeks have you got? Now, it'll go for commercial, unless they're very, very desperate. Again, the number of times I've been out competing for roles, and it's gone down to, someone's got 6 months in a role, I've got 10 years, but they've got 6 months commercial. So whether this is an unfortunate byproduct of professionalizing archaeology is unclear, but it is certainly a barrier. So, quick conclusions. There have been a lot of improvements over the past 5 decades with archaeological employment. Unfortunately, sometimes feel a lot of babies have been thrown out with the bathwater. Improvements to safety are welcomed, but the blanket implementation is tending to exclude disabled people. In part, of course, that's because we have better conditions. Believe it or not, our archaeology pay is much, much better than when I started. My first paycheck was 3.5 times what I would get on the dole. Now it would be about 5 to 6. We've got health and safety protection. Away accommodation used to be, pitch your tent over there, mate. As I said, it's the same with increasing professionalization. There's great upsides to it, but the downside is devaluing of non-commercial experience. Too often, even the roles that people could fulfill with disabilities are filled by commercial people moving sideways rather than getting us into training schemes. The only routinely positive change I've seen is that except when discussing non-drivers, it now seems less acceptable to use derogatory language directly aimed at the person or in their hearing than in previous times. However, is that really an improvement? Personally, I'd rather hear transphobic or ableist banter while in work, not be there to hear it because I'm in the job centre. The more so because I get the impression that the barriers caused by these attitudes haven't gone. They're just cloaked like a lurking Klingon bird of prey. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kimberly. Some really powerful testament there again about what it's actually like to try and operate in our sector, where the barriers can become really, really live to your own personal experience. I'm going to ask our 3 speakers if they could come back up on stage, please, to see if there are any questions. From me, just reflecting back on what we've heard this morning, Bethan's conversation around anti-oppressive theory and actually looking at how do we deconstruct heritage a bit and look to other areas where we could reconstruct it in a more open manner, I thought was really, really powerful. And then listening to Trey, that really evocative violence of knowledge, I think that was really a really powerful way that actually not all knowledge is equal to us all. It has different impacts. I'm often very struck how our words have deep meaning, and sometimes we don't actually think about those things. Heritage is brilliant, again, as I mentioned, of doing this. If you don't like our version of heritage, we'll tell you it's at risk and you're about to lose it. And we'll evoke this threat that actually somehow, if you don't join our club, you're not actually part of that club. And then finally, listening to Kimberly really give that evocative presentation about what it means to be an individual in this sector and actually survive in there. I think it was really powerful. So I'm going to open it up to any questions. Yes.
I just want to ask if it's going to be a before giving the talks.
No.
And if you consider such a meeting and looking at the commonality between some of the barriers that you experience in the different areas, but also look at potential solutions within heritage and wellbeing based on those barriers, because I think there's nothing better than people with lived experience coming up with solutions based on all of your lived experiences and your colleagues, friends, families, because you can all describe things that are similar but in different ways of doing it. So I'd be really interested to know what solutions you would come up with.
Who'd like to go first? Trey, you go. You jump in.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. And I think each one of us is talking about different forms of violence. I was talking more about the interpersonal areas of that and how it has institutional and structural origins. And then previous talk was also about interpersonal, but also transphobia being institutionalized and structuralized. And then your talk was also about institutions and structures of climate change, because it's not about having more cardboard straws, obviously. It's about telling BP and Shell to stop dumping in the oceans and big institutions. So I think, there's probably a lot of crossover, but a lot of distinctions. But I think it is focused on systems, because if you get the systems right, then I won't have to complain on an individual level.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I agree with Trey. I think, we should definitely have an interesting conversation about kind of, a lot of it's about the really big things of how these things are running and how I think all of us looking at how various systems that want to make things better are falling short.
I'm really pleased that you actually felt they went together, because obviously part of the challenge when you have all of these sort of databases is how do you get things to actually go together? And that complementary nature is really important, that there isn't one side to actually address this from.
Yeah.
We actually need to understand all of them. Okay, who else had a question? Yes.
I think there is so much of what you said absolutely resonated with me. I was born with one arm quite obviously where, very prosthetic arm nowadays, used to cover it up a lot. Had various instances of being asked to do certain things in job interviews that had nothing to do with the job, just to prove that I could do things basically. And at the Heritage Trust Network where I work, it's become a personal mission to make everything we do as inclusive as possible. And I just wondered if yourself, as the person who's been talking about disability, but the rest of the panelists as well, have any sort of, it sounds very basic, but top tips for making recruitment process more inclusive so that we get away from this.
Well, the first problem is with the inclusivity is to actually monitor what people are doing. We will get, well, one of the problems is that we all get these lovely forms, don't we? Inclusivity monitoring. Yeah, and those sort of get shoved to one side. We never find any feedback. I don't know whether it's gender-based, ethnicity, disability, as to, okay, how many of those companies are actually fulfilling anything more? It's a bit related to what I was saying about, ask that employer. It's like, no, that shouldn't be a barrier. No, that shouldn't be a barrier. Oh, is there a job going? And it's very similar. Oh, we filled this, or we've signed up to this partnership.
Yeah.
So what are you doing? Oh, we signed up to the partnership.
And I think that goes back to what I was saying. It's that's the canteen culture of London Metropolitan Police. But we see it in universities, we see it in schools. Sorry, you're not the right fit for the job. That sort of language, it's all coded. You're either not white enough, male enough, straight enough, whatever. And it comes up to bodies and whether you fit the institution. But yeah, also from a disability point of view, I'm autistic as well. So you go to a job interview and there's all these things they want you to do to prove that you're good for the job, but also these things are not neurodiversity affirming. I think one of the big ones is I've asked for the interview questions to be emailed ahead. And then they make you out to be as if you're asking the world, effectively. And I had that when I was applying for my PhD. And also it was University of Bristol, who don't have a good track record when it comes to mental health as well. So yeah, so there's all of that stuff when it comes to interviews and jobs. Yeah, it's a minefield. But one of the things I would say is that a lot of the accommodations that work for disabled people work for everybody. So there's not really any excuse. Like if you apply the things that disabled activists tell you to do, it helps everybody. Because ableism isn't just about disability; it's putting its violence upon the body, effectively, and the mind. So you can be. Most people will be disabled in their lifetime in some ways. Glasses is a disability. At one point, it would have been disability. So yeah, so most people will be disabled in their lifetime. And it was one saying. So accommodation-wise, most things that work for disabled people will work for everybody. Not everything, but most things, I think.
It's an interesting one because earlier on, I mentioned being in the army. Now, because of the deformed feet, I am actually statutory by law unable to serve in the army. 1991, 1990, I was working on a project in Jordan as a surveyor. Saddam invaded Kuwait. All of a sudden, people decided that someone of my physical level who spoke Arabic could work in the desert. We'll ignore that prohibition. But what is interesting with heritage is we keep seeing all these things about, oh, it's a shortage, oh, we can't recruit staff. You'd have thought they would move over, and even the army moved over when it was banned in law. But no, we don't do heritage.
So much to think about. Thank you so much for doing it. And I actually think that was brilliant having you putting together that giving us that foundation of theoretical and we are sort of saying about those down barriers and giving that kinship and belonging. And then coming to your experience about not feeling welcome and or doing a project and then seeing another project at the same site and actually it's in conflict with what you were feeling around that site. So I'm just wondering if you have any doctor suggestions around what would make you feel welcome for a community engagement project. For example, outside of Delapre Abbey, a big ground site, what would make you feel welcome? What would make you so kind of like your issue there about top tips for recruitment and inclusive recruitment. Do you have any suggestions for top tips to ensure just that tick box exercise that really ensures that there is an inclusive community engagement project that's happening? That's a really good
I think one of the things is the term politics. Politics isn't just party politics. Anything that involves people is political. So I'd say that when it comes to anti-racism, for example, it's all political. You can't do anti-racist work and not have it be political. So I think looking at the landscape around you, the political landscape, also the actual landscape, and the things around the monarchy were huge stories. I guess from the summer of 2020 up to the summer of 2022, because you had all that media noise around Prince William being in the Caribbean and anti-slavery protests in Jamaica and Barbados and Belize. And I think Barbados now got their independence again from the monarchy. So all of that stuff. Then you had the Jubilee, you had the Queen's funeral, you had all that nonsense happening as well, and all the media noise around that. And then you had the coronation, and there was protests on all three of those issues. And then you've got heritage sites saying, let's do garden parties for the monarchy, and it sort of comes across as very dismissive of not just the black people and the brown people that you want to come in, but also working class communities as well, queer communities. Colonialism didn't just affect me; it affected people based on their gender, based on their class, based on their sexuality. There's a whole grift of work on queerness and colonialism that also needs to be looked at in these contexts as well. So I think when it comes to anti-racism work in particular, but also really just anti-oppression work, you can't support institutions that are consciously violent towards huge groups of people and then say, let's go and do tea on the lawn, because it's not right at all. I just come from someone that played cricket all his life as well. So so there's all that history, but also how that history is in the present as well. So and a modern day example would be Palestine. You can't just say, oh, let's do tea on the lawn, colonialism, afternoon tea is a colonial practice as well. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying when you do it, be critical of yourself when you do it. But also how these practices are also greenlighting what Israel is doing to Palestinians. The genocide of Palestinian people has repercussions in this country as well. All our decisions about colonialism and coloniality are basically saying whether their lives matter or not. So Black Lives Matter, all the stuff around Sarah Everard, violence against women and girls, all of that stuff, it comes back to empire and violence and all that stuff. So the logic of it is also needs to be thought about within politics. So, but it goes back to the question I said earlier about West Northampton Council. Can you effectively do anti-oppression work and your oversight being council? And that's the question, really, I think. And that's an open question. I don't have the answers for that. So yeah, hopefully that answered some of your question. Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
really good.
One of the things we do have to be careful with the community projects, I've done a few, is when we have commercial partners.
Yeah.
The problem is with the commercial partners, they have a nasty habit of out the way, out the way. We are the expert. Actually, no, this person here has a PhD in the subject. The person you've sent is a lot less experienced, and we've seen that a few times. So that's a thing I think is really important is to make sure when you engage going out to people that you let your commercial partners, if you've got one, know, hang on, no, we already have people in this role, and this role from this. We want a partnership, not a, I don't know, what kind of washing can we call it?
No, really good. I'm just going to reflect back on that word council, and we have a challenge, it's in our title. And young people would say, we're here to tell you what to do. You act like a council, where actually in 1944, when our council was created, it was created as a collective. A council or a collective. And so we are thinking how we actually shift some of that, because it becomes a real perception barrier.
I think also about community, you'll find a lot of places in the global south, so countries that were colonized broadly do it a lot better than we do here. That's natural to them. So when my grandparents came to this country, they came from a place where everyone relied on each other. My great grandparents were farmers in Grenada, and the community relied on basically people who were farming to give them food and sell them food in the village, stuff like that. So a lot of those medieval type practices of industrial farming come from ideas of community and community democracy. So there was a medieval idea called the Frank Pledge as well. And that idea was exported to Sierra Leone in the 16th century. And that was the place where women first voted. Not in England, not in New Zealand, as Google will tell you, but it was actually Sierra Leone where women had to vote first in 1792 because of an Anglo-Saxon form of government. So old can also be better, and modern doesn't always mean better. Doesn't always mean better as well. That's what I'm going to say about that. Yeah,
brilliant. Okay, one more question from the floor, and then we need to wrap up. Yes.
Troy mentioned social class very briefly, and I really love that term entanglements.
Oh yeah.
Into relationships with all different factors and act as barriers to participation and inclusion. And I want to ask them how really just very quickly what their experiences of social class and in their work and in their careers and how those have affected their approaches.
I go first. Where I come from, being South Welsh, not quite the same. I mean, my university, Cardiff, pretty much had open access. We still do. When I started in archaeology, I would say most people, including myself, are working class. I understand in England it's a bit different, but maybe because of our stereotypical mining background, our education, our openness to education and what can come from it, where I come from, is a lot less kind I have seen elsewhere.
Well, in kind of two-part answer, like my work is informed by my class in that I'm middle class and access to do this amount of higher education in humanities is kind of facilitated by that, especially living in Cornwall where everything costs a lot of money. And then in terms of my work and my theory, I think a lot of people writing about class is real recognition of essentially like solidarity between causes and looking at structures rather than sort of dismantling some of these groups of kind of, you know, we're working class activists and we're like black activists, because actually a lot of the time there's a lot of functional kind of inter-solidarity to be had, which has a lot more power systemically.
Yeah. I'll say my positionality is probably from someone that grew up middle class. My parents sent me to private education from when I was 4 years old in Northampton to probably the age of 16 when I left to go to a further education college. So I had the full spectrum of a private education. But when you look like me and have one like that, people constantly just assume you don't know stuff. So you're able just to pass these spaces. People think you're stupid, and then you just observe everything. And then I think that's where I come from with class. And I've written about it as well. So I've written like personal essays about my experience in private school, experience of both classism and of racism. Because even though I'd grown up middle class, when I went to private school, because my parents came from new money compared to old money, you're basically working class, effectively. Like you're the money that your family has owned has only been within a generation, whilst many of the other families, the white families, had that money given to them from their grandparents and from previous generations. And many of those families probably had links with the slave trade, the East India Company, the South Sea Company, those sorts of colonial companies. And yeah, so they had everything handed to them. My parents basically worked so I could go to private school. And same with my brother now, who's also in private school. So when you do look like me and you have that sort of education, people tend to treat you differently. We're not always in a very racist and very classist way. But also when it comes to whiteness, there's a whiteness of class as well. You've heard of people like George Orwell. So George Orwell, the author of 1984, An Animal Farm, wrote another book called The Road to the Wigan Pier. And there he talks about how he had a middle class upbringing, and he was taught to see the working class as dirty. And that's also about whiteness. And he was seen as white. So then within that hierarchy of whiteness, you've got groups of people racialized as white who are not seen as white by other white people. So there's that. So when Irish people first came to England, for example, they were lumped in with the Caribbean people because English people did not see Irish people as white, even though today we can see that many Irish people would be racialized as white. So there's that whole hierarchy of whiteness and who is white and who is not white enough in that sense. So that's where I come from with class, I had a private education, and that placed me in greater proximity to people who had money and the establishment and stuff like that. By rights, I should not be here in that sense. I should be a conservative person who looks down on other people because of the education I had, but I don't. All my work is very, very anti-imperialist. All of that stuff, everything that private school hates. I write about private ownership. I've written about Jane Austen and slavery and all of the stuff that she talks about in those books. So yeah, so that's where I come from with class. It's in my personality, but also something I've written about in relation to race and other, I guess, characteristics and so on. But yeah.
Okay, we have gone over, so I'm going to stop you there. Not that I don't want you to stop talking, because this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think what I've heard that's really interesting there, when we think about the rest of the next 2 days, it's actually, again, it's this conversation, whose well-being are we actually thinking about, and how are we letting others into what potentially is our concept of well-being, which is an analogy for the whole of heritage, if you actually like. I think we've done that conversation of expressing what we think is heritage well. And I think actually just listening to the conversation we've had here is actually how do we create that approach that allows others to forcibly come into that conversation and actually be part of it. And again, I think there's a lot of reflection on what we need to actually change as ourselves. So I'd like to thank our panel here who've been and our speakers. That was really fascinating and great. There are tours going on. It's lunch next up at 12:15, and then we're back in here later this afternoon for another few sessions. So thank you very much.